For decades, he existed as a shadow stretching across California, a name whispered in police briefings and late-night news reports, the Golden State Killer. Between the 1970s and 1980s, he moved through quiet suburbs with chilling confidence, committing burglaries that escalated into rapes and murders, leaving behind shattered families and a state gripped by fear. Investigators chased fragments, shoe prints and flower beds, whispered phone calls to victims, crude knots left behind as signatures of control. But every lead dissolved with time. The case grew cold not because it lacked effort, but because the man behind it understood how to vanish in plain sight. Years passed, then decades. Victims aged, detectives retired, and yet the crimes refused to fade. They lingered in evidence rooms, sealed envelopes, and untested DNA, silent and waiting.
True Cold File.
In the years after the attacks, the Golden State Killer became many things at once: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, a collection of cases spread across jurisdictions that never fully realized they were hunting the same predator. Survivors described a voice that whispered threats in the dark, a figure who studied routines, who knew when doors were unlocked and lights were off. He struck, disappeared, then called months or years later, proving he was still watching. Traditional policing reached its limits, sketches aged poorly, witness memories faded, but the evidence endured. Biological samples, carefully preserved, carried something investigators in the 1970s could never have imagined using: a genetic fingerprint capable of outlasting time itself. By the early 2000s, genetic profiling had already transformed criminal justice, but this case demanded something more. The Golden State Killer had never been arrested, never entered into a criminal database. His DNA had no name attached to it. That is where a radical approach emerged: genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for the killer directly, investigators searched for his relatives. Crime scene DNA was converted into a format compatible with public genealogy databases, and what returned was not a suspect, but a family tree. Branch by branch, generation by generation, analysts mapped distant cousins and shared ancestors. It was painstaking work, less like a manhunt and more like archaeology. Every new connection narrowed the field towards someone who had lived an unremarkable life, precisely the kind of life that allows monsters to hide. As the family tree took shape, investigators began the quiet work of elimination, layering dates, addresses, military records, and employment histories onto the branches. Again and again, they asked the same question: who could have been in the right place at the right time, repeatedly over years? One name resurfaced: a former police officer, a husband, a father, a man who blended seamlessly into suburban California. Joseph James DeAngelo had lived among his victims' communities, shopped in their stores, raised children, and aged quietly while the case bearing his crimes became legend. Surveillance teams followed him for weeks, watching mundane routines, yard work, grocery trips, casual conversations with neighbors. After 40 years, the tension no longer came from fear of another attack, but from the weight of anticipation. The hunt was nearing its end. That moment arrived not with sirens or a chase, but with something painfully ordinary. Investigators collected items DeAngelo had discarded, objects meant to be forgotten. A DNA sample recovered from that refuse was enough. When the results returned, the match was undeniable. The genetic code preserved from crime scenes decades earlier aligned perfectly with the man living quietly in Citrus Heights. In April 2018, officers moved in swiftly. DeAngelo was arrested outside his home, stunned and stripped of the anonymity that had protected him for most of his life. For survivors, the news arrived like an emotional shockwave. Relief collided with grief. Justice had come, but impossibly late. When DeAngelo stood before the court, the scale of his crimes became undeniable. Prosecutors connected him to dozens of attacks, burglaries, sexual assaults, and murders that had terrorized California for more than a decade. Survivors, many now elderly, faced the man who had once whispered threats in their homes, who had promised to return, who had lived in their nightmares for 40 years. Some spoke with shaking voices, others with controlled resolve. DeAngelo said almost nothing. In 2020, he pled guilty to multiple counts, accepting responsibility in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The legal chapter closed, but emotionally there was no clean ending. Justice had arrived, yet it could not restore stolen youth, broken families, or lost decades. What it offered was certainty. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of the Golden State Killer's capture rippled across the country. Evidence rooms were reopened, old DNA samples were retested. Investigators no longer asked whether a case was too old, but whether the evidence still existed. Genetic genealogy had proven that time was no longer a shield. A person could age, relocate, change names, build a family, and still be traced through bloodlines they never knew would speak for them. The case became a landmark not because of its brutality, but because it redefined what justice could look like after decades of silence. The arrest also ignited ethical debate. Privacy advocates questioned how much of ourselves we expose through public DNA databases. Families wondered whether a distant relative's curiosity could one day bring law enforcement to their door. But for survivors, the equation felt different. For them, genetic genealogy was not a threat, but a voice. The Golden State Killer had relied on the assumption that technology would never catch up to him. That assumption was wrong. Today, the legacy of the case is measured not only in convictions, but in possibility. What once required confessions or luck now begins with data and patience. For the victims, the arrest did not erase the past, but it ended the killer's control over the future. His anonymity, his greatest weapon, was taken from him at last. And for families who waited decades for a name, the answer, however late, allowed grief to finally settle into something closer to peace. The capture of the Golden State Killer stands as a warning to those who believe time can bury truth. For more than 40 years, Joseph James DeAngelo lived an ordinary life while the consequences of his actions echoed endlessly through others. He believed evidence would decay and memories would fail. What he never accounted for was a future where science could reach backward, threading together fragments of history to speak for the voiceless. This was not a story of a dramatic chase or a final confession, but of a door that finally closed after decades left open. A reminder that justice does not always arrive quickly, but it can arrive precisely, and when it does, it echoes far beyond a single arrest.
If you're captivated by stories where the truth finally comes to light, make sure to subscribe to True Cold Files. Every week, we uncover real cases where justice took decades, but never disappeared.